Greetings YouTube, and welcome back to Sewing for Beginners. So far in this series we've learned many different seams and hems, and now we want to put all those skills together and make ourselves a garment. This is where sewing patterns come in. At first these can be quite daunting, full of confusing symbols. Hopefully by the end of this video it will all make more sense. I'm going to do this in two parts. In this first video we're going to look at understanding the symbols and how to correctly prepare the fabric and cut out the patterns. In the next video, we're going to look at how to adapt the patterns to get a better fit, because none of us are an exact standard size. All patterns come with a size chart showing the length, bust, waist and hip measurement that corresponds with each pattern size. I recommend that you use the pattern size that fits your largest measurement. You can then either adjust the pattern or you can take it in where you need once you finish the garment. When you're just starting out making patterns, I suggest using the simpler patterns, like these shift dresses for example. They come with minimal pieces. The fewer the pieces in the pattern, the simpler it is for the beginner to work with. Let's take a look at some of the things we'll need. We'll need a good pair of paper scissors for cutting out the patterns. We might also find a see-through ruler, some tape, and a pen useful. We might also consider tracing our paper pattern, so we can get pattern paper or tracing paper by the roll, which we can use to trace the pattern, keeping the original paper pattern intact. This is useful for when you want to make this pattern for multiple people. You can make one pattern for each person. This will also be useful if you want to make adaptations to the pattern, and you can do this without worrying about ruining the original. When it comes to transferring the pattern to fabric, we'll need some tailor's chalk. We will need some pins and a good pair of fabric scissors. Other items we might find useful are pinking shears for cutting fabric that frays easily, needle and thread cutters, a cutting board and rotary cutter, pattern weights. Although any small but hefty household item will do, I use these curtain weights, and of course some fabric. The first and most important step is to wash our fabric. Depending on the fabric, washing can sometimes shrink or stretch the fibres, so we want to do that before we cut out our pattern, rather than after we finish our garment, only to discover it no longer fits after the first time we wash it. We also want to iron out any creases or wrinkles. This will give us the best foundation for a nicely fitted garment. We fold the fabric along its length with the selvage edge together. The selvage runs along both sides of the length of the fabric. It's a woven edge along the fabric that prevents it from unravelling or fraying. The selvage is useful for when we have seams of a straight edge. We can place these against the selvage, which automatically gives us a neat edge without having to finish it. We lay out our fabric with the right sides together, that's the outside of the fabric, so that when we make any markings they will be on the wrong side of the fabric or the inside of the garment. Here we have a few paper patterns to take a look at. You'll see that most patterns come with a few variations. Each pattern comes with a set of instructions showing all the pieces, how to lay it on the fabric, and the order in which to stitch it all together. Most patterns will tell you how much fabric you'll need and whether or not seam allowance is included. Standard seam allowance is usually around 1/2 inch. It always says in the instructions the seam allowance used for this pattern. Here it says seam allowance is 5/8 inch unless otherwise stated. So if there is a difference it will be stated in the instructions at that particular step. If our pattern doesn't include seam allowance, we simply trace around our pattern and then go around that traced line with our see-through ruler, making our own seam allowance. This allows us to make our own preferred seam allowance. It also gives us a handy stitching line. For patterns of multiple sizes, the size will be indicated next to the cutting line. So we just cut along the line according to our size. Many patterns have different line styles for different sizes to avoid confusion. While we can still get mass-produced paper patterns like this, it's now very common to get patterns as a digital download. Once we've downloaded our pattern, we make sure that our printer scaling is set to 100% and print out a test page. And these test pages will come with a scale, and we can use a tape measure or a ruler to check that the measurements are correct. Once we're happy the scale's correct, we can print out our pattern onto A4 paper. There will usually be a small margin along the edges, which we can cut out. And we join our pattern together by joining up the registration marks, making sure that all the edges of the pattern line up along with the registration point. Once everything's neatly lined up, we can tape our pieces together and keep going until we've constructed our entire pattern. On your pattern pieces, you will see these double-pointed arrows. The arrows might be in different styles, but there will always be a double-sided arrow showing the direction of the grain line. The length of the fabric is referred to as the lengthwise grain or straight grain. The width is the cross grain, and the diagonal in either direction is referred to as the bias. The bias has a little stretch to it and more movement than the grain. We place our pattern pieces with the grain line following the straight grain, so it should be parallel to the selvage edge. If we place them higgledy-piggledy, then we could end up cutting our pieces on the bias, and the pieces will stretch and distort, making our garment look like a horrible mess. So make sure that our arrows are pointing along the length of the fabric. On some pattern pieces, you'll find a double-pointed arrow that points towards the cutting edge of the pattern, and it will usually tell you to place on fold. We place this along the folded edge of our fabric, so that when we cut it out, we have one symmetrical piece. Some pattern pieces don't have that arrow, but will still tell you to place on fold, so make sure you check all your pieces carefully. On our patterns, we'll find these small triangular markings. These are called notches, and they help us line up our pattern pieces. So for example, when we're stitching our front and back pieces together, we make sure that the notches line up at the side seams and at the shoulder seams. We also have notches showing where to gather a piece of fabric. By lining up the notches of the corresponding piece, we know by how much to gather our fabric. To mark our notches, we cut into the seam allowance, about 1/4 inch, wherever there's a notch marking. It's these slits that we line up when sewing our seams. Notches aren't always a triangle, sometimes they're represented by a little line. And some patterns will show where to place things such as buttons or buttonholes, and where to place zips. We use these to mark on our fabric where we need to place our buttons, loops and other fastenings. On many pattern pieces you will find a line where you can lengthen or shorten the garment, usually 2 parallel lines, and it will tell you to lengthen or shorten here. We will cover lengthening and shortening pattern pieces in more detail in the next video. Now we're ready to cut our pattern. We fold our fabric with the selvage edges together with the right sides facing. And we begin to lay out our pattern in accordance with our grain line and fold line markings, and we're ready to transfer our pattern onto the fabric. There are a few methods of transferring the pattern onto the fabric. The first is to draw around the pattern with tailor's chalk. If you want to, you can use weights to hold it into place, or just hold the piece flat as you draw around it. Remember to mark out any notches or other marks. We can use pins to attach the pattern pieces to the fabric. Ensure that both the pattern piece and the fabric beneath it are lying smooth and flat. We pin all the way around, and we can simply cut around the pattern piece with it pinned in place. This won't work so well with very delicate or stretch fabrics, as the pins can snag or permanently pierce the fabric. When cutting the pattern, we want to make sure that the fabric remains flat. Hold it steady as we cut along the pattern. on a flat, even surface. Another option is to lay our fabric down on a cutting mat and use a rotary cutter. We can weigh our pieces down with fabric weights. We then just work around our pattern pieces with the rotary cutter, and before removing the weights, we go around the pattern with a pair of scissors. We snip any notches. Your pattern will likely include darts. These add shaping and help turn a 2D pattern into a 3D garment. These are usually found around the bust and waistline. After we've cut out our pattern, we need to mark our darts onto our pieces, and we do that using the dots shown on the pattern. There are probably dozens of ways to mark darts. I'm going to briefly demonstrate a few here. If you want to see a more in-depth video on marking darts, let me know in the comments. First is the pin method. Use these pins with the small head. You want the head that's small enough to pull through the paper pattern, but not through the fabric. And we simply push these pins through the dots on the pattern, pushing the pin through both layers of fabric and tugging it through the paper pattern. We keep going until we've pulled a pin through all of the dots. When we're done, we can unpin our pattern. And when we turn the piece over, we have our pin sticking out the other side. We then take more pins and we push them through the same point where each pin is sticking out. We then very carefully pull these two pieces apart, pulling the pins through the fabric, but going carefully, making sure not to lose any. Now we have two darts marked with pins. The side with the pin heads is the wrong side of our work, which is where we're going to stitch. We leave this one pin at the tip to mark our dart point, and we can use these pins to pin our dart ready for sewing. We bring our pin from one side through where the pin comes out on the other side. We fold the dart matching those 2 points and pin it in place, and we can remove the second pin. And we repeat these steps for the other pairs of pins. And there we have a dart pinned and ready for sewing. We stitch a line following where the pin heads poke out. If you wish, you can draw a line between each point to mark where to stitch the dart. Once you're practiced, this can be quite a quick method, although some might find it very fiddly. But there are a few other ways we can mark darts, so let's take a look. Another method is using tailor tacks. We take some basting thread in a contrasting colour, doubled up and thread onto a needle, and we don't knot the end. Again, working with the dots marked on the dart. We sew down through a dot at the bottom of the dart, and we leave a fairly long tail. We then come back up through that same spot, pulling the thread through, leaving a loop underneath. Come down through the next dot, and come back up through the same spot, leaving a loop underneath. We repeat that all the way around the dart. And when we've made our tacks, we take our scissors or thread cutters and snip the loops in the middle. We can then unpin our pattern, pull the paper away. We then slowly separate our two pieces, and as we pull the pieces apart, we snip the thread in the middle. We then have our markings on both sides, and we can use these markings to draw out the legs of our dart. And when we fold our dart, we can use these tacks as a reference for lining up the dart. The tailor tack method is very good if you're working with textured fabrics. Another method is marking through the pattern onto the fabric. We can use a pin or an awl or any other sharp pointy object to break through the dots of the paper. With a well-sharpened chalk pencil, mark through the dots onto the fabric. We unpin the pattern and turn the fabric over. We then place the pattern back down so we can mark the darts on the other side. And when we've marked both sides, we can use our ruler to join up our dots. This will work well on most medium and heavyweight fabrics, but on very light fabrics that move around a lot, or on textured fabric, this method doesn't work so well. So that's it for this video. Hopefully it's all a little less bamboozling now, and you're ready to start using patterns and making your own clothes. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you don't want to miss the next video where we start to adapt the pattern to fit us better. See you next time. Bye!